Thank you. We will go ahead and get started on making differentiation doable using technology to practice words, phrases, and paragraphs. So as a classroom teacher, I always felt like differentiation was not always doable, and it was seemed to be a little bit impossible to do everything for everyone. So how can we make differentiation doable? We hope this presentation will help you to begin to answer that question. I think we'll just skim the surface, but it'll give you something to think about. So we're going to talk about what is differentiation and what is scaffolding, because to know the difference and how they work together will help you answer the question on how to differentiate and make it doable. What role can educative technology play in differentiation? How does the word knowledge network provide a guide for differentiation and purposeful practice, which is part of differentiation? And a technology example using sortagory. So that's our agenda. We'll go ahead and get started. We welcome you to add questions to the chat at any time, and we'll answer them throughout if we during little pauses. First, we want to give you an opportunity to think about what is differentiation. What are your thoughts about differentiation? In the chat, just put a word or two, a definition, any thoughts that comes to mind right now about differentiation.
I have access, meeting student needs, individualized, meeting students at their level, meeting students where they're ready, underutilized, needed to help kids succeed, meeting needs.
Those are all great. Keep them coming in.
Success.
While we do that, what does etymology.com, what does the etymology dictionary say? What is differentiation? Where did it come from? Well, from medieval Latin times, a long time ago, 1800s, it's to make different. It's to be what distinguishes between. So diversity, differences, to make different. So many of you are already hitting that idea in the chat. A couple other definitions of differentiation. One is from Andrea out of New York. She's a teacher and a blogger who contributed to a Newsweek article about differentiation. Were you thinking tailoring instruction in your thoughts? Diverse groups of learners, were you thinking about that when you thought about differentiation? Without differentiating, somebody will be left out or left behind. So being inclusive with differentiation. Tomlinson, differentiated instruction is defined as adjusting lessons to meet students' needs. So are you thinking about adjusting lessons for whom? For all kids, just the kids at risk? Or are you thinking those adjusted lessons are for? We'll answer that question. We have to use data. So are you thinking about responding to data when you think about differentiation? Are you thinking about developing lessons in instructional groups when thinking about differentiation? No wonder it's such a heavy lift when we think about everything that we want differentiation to do. It's a lot for teachers to grapple with. Nancy Young, and in her book, Climbing the Ladder, Reading and Writing with Jan Hasbrook. I have that at my side here. She has a definition of differentiation: the provision of instruction and supporting materials that addresses differences in learner needs. She talks about grouping in various ways based on skills and ability rather than ages. So a little hint in there that we want to differentiate for all kids, not just kids at risk. Again, Young and Hasbrook talk about differentiation means teaching differently to address student variance and needs. So are those some of the things you were thinking about when I offered the opportunity just to think about differentiation for a minute? If you haven't already checked into this book, Climbing the Ladder of Reading and Writing, it is loaded with ideas and things for differentiation. We're just going to barely skim the instructional component of differentiation, even though this book takes on many more domains. Think about what you're doing every day. Many of us have just ended our school year, and you made shifts and changes in response to learners in front of you. That is differentiation. You are responding to learners on a continuum. That is differentiation. You're operating on instinct, but you're also operating on the other extreme of the continuum based on data. You're planning lessons based on data. you're adjusting those lessons based on instinct, based on feedback that you're seeing when your students are particularly performing a particular task. So anytime you make shifts and changes in response to the learners in front of you, you are providing differentiated instruction. So it should help you feel better to know that you are differentiating instruction every day when you have kids in front of you and you're making these micro shifts. But what else can we do to be more purposeful about planning for differentiation? To be more purposeful in planning about differentiation, this graphic really spoke to me in a blog by Mark Anderson. It's a little bit older, 2018, but it was the best graphic I could find to illustrate differentiation. So you have the teacher here and you have the learner on the scaffolds, right? Well, the scaffolds, as the student masters the concepts at each step, they get closer to mastery. Notice the scaffolds here are thicker at the bottom and they get a little bit thinner at top, because as they're reaching mastery, perhaps that they don't need quite as much, right? So the scaffolds, I want you to think of the scaffolds as the steps, right? The differentiation and scaffolds or the steps have to do with the content. The differentiation has to do with the learner. So this arrow is going to each of the learners, right? So you have a teacher here planning, maybe feeling overwhelmed, but if you think of it in terms of scaffolds and content, differentiation having to do with what you know about each learner, then the practice with increasing complexity as you go up the steps toward mastery can help us make more sense. I want to make the point, and I'll make it again later, that scaffolds do not mean you're making it easier for kids. You're zeroing in on what they know based on your data so that you get in that exact pinpointed area so that they can get to the next step. So we're going to come back to this graphic. I thought it was just really great to think about the difference between scaffolds and differentiation and really how they work together. So let's look at a chart that talks about, again, the differentiation between the difference between differentiation and scaffolding. The scaffolding is aligned to the concepts or the skills. So the steps have to do with the content. Scaffolds are sequential. We're trying to get to mastery and deeper understanding of the concepts. So we're not dumbing things down. We want to get to mastery, but some students might need smaller steps or thicker, if you will, using this graphic, scaffolds. It requires that the teacher be deeply knowledgeable about what is taught, which is why we're here at Patton, right? We're learning about the science of reading so that we can scaffold appropriately. We need to have deep knowledge of the content. So what about differentiation then? We're talking about what does the data say about that student? It's the manner and how much time we need to practice. So there's that practice arrow at the top to review and to give feedback. So we want to use really good use of our instructional time so that we're giving the right amount of practice and feedback so that students can reach mastery. Different students need different amounts of practice, as we know. Differentiation requires that teacher is deeply knowledgeable of the students, though, and the level of performance. So look at the bottom row between scaffolding and differentiation. Scaffolding, we need to be really solid on the science of reading, deep knowledge of the science of reading and writing, and differentiation, deep knowledge of what we know about the student. Those two come together to allow us to differentiate using appropriate scaffolding. That takes us into Nancy Young's ladder of reading and writing. They recently redid their book. She and Jan Hasbrook co-authored, co-edited a book about the ladder of reading and writing. This has been out for years, since 2012. It was revised in 2023, revised again in 2024. What I love about this is this continues to be revised according to new information. And we should always strive as educators to revise our thinking according to new information. So we're looking, if you look at the ladder from the bottom, we're looking at the kids who need the most support. Learning to read requires code-based, explicit, intensive instruction, and frequent repetitions. Some of those kids could be on an IEP. Then we go into the orange. Notice these are gradient lines. They're not hard lines anymore. They kind of flow into the other one. you're looking at maybe 40 to 45% of the kids, they require explicit instruction, but not so much, not as much as the kids perhaps in the red. Then you get into this light green, learning to read is easier with broad instruction. Some explicit instruction is coming in, but it is 30 to 35% of our kids. And then you get to the deeper green, and that's where some implicit learning is more readily available for kids, and they can do more discovery learning, but they need differentiation too. So if we look at the arrows on the side, look at the arrows, we're going to focus on the purple arrow. I do want to say, though, that Nancy's book does deal with differentiation with regard to environment, student factors. We're just not going to talk about that today. It's a whole nother session, but we're right here, differentiation, systematically designed and data informed. And as much as I wanted to turn this arrow to be horizontal so you could read it better, it was important to leave it in this fashion. So we realized that the differentiation is for all learners, regardless of where they are on the ladder of reading and writing. So what does that say again? Differentiation, systematically designed. So this is the definition right out of their book. What does systematically designed instruction mean? It's planned, it's strategic. Let's look at that word first of all, strategic. It's not by the seat of our pants, right? Strategic planned instruction, appropriate components of lesson content. This is what the student needs to learn in the appropriate order and amount with the appropriate methods. So we have to know right here what the student needs. So you're into student data, right? And content. So you're marrying the two. And again, this explains it very deeply in this book that I highly recommend. The other part of this arrow is data informed, right? So Dr. Jan Hasbrook is definitely someone I've learned a lot from in terms of data informed instruction. Differentiation for student needs based on data obtained in one or more ways using appropriate tools and measures. So we'll dip into appropriate tools and measures here in just a minute, but that's what we're talking about when we're talking about data informed instruction. We differentiate with good data because that helps us understand the learner. So I went through that kind of quickly. Think for a moment with all of that information. What are some barriers to differentiation? We need to know about the learner. We need to know about the science of reading. What are some barriers? Can you tell us that in the chat box?
Seeing anything in the chat so far?
Okay, I'm going to help you out.
Oops, sorry.
Okay, time.
I have
okay.
some. They're coming to me as a direct message. So I have
Oh,
time,
okay.
former incorrect teacher training, time and resources, classroom behaviors, former
Yes.
incorrect teacher training, extra time to plan appropriate instruction, lack of resources,
Time
no
and program.
assistance or paras.
There's a lot of barriers, right? In Nancy's book, Nancy and Jan, they talk about 4 types of management needed to differentiate instruction. They talk about time, environment, behavior, and instruction. We're really only talking about instruction for this particular session, but you're right. All of those things are barriers. Lack of teacher knowledge based on the science of reading. We just said how important deep teacher knowledge is to differentiate well. Let's say you are unsure about using predictable books, for example, and you're trying to differentiate using a predictable book when really what the student needs is a decodable reader, right? So your intentions are really good to differentiate, but your tools are off. That's going to be a problem, and that's based on teacher knowledge. It could also be based on lack of resources. You could have misinformation about how students learn. So you might think, well, these students, they can just memorize all of these words, and you're just going to give them fewer words to memorize now. That's one way of you to cut back, but that's not really going to help because that's not how students learn, right? There could be misinformation about differentiation in general. If we think that differentiation is not doable, we may not do anything at all because it just seems too difficult. And then also misinformation about how MTSS works. And there's plenty of sessions here at Patton in the next few days about MTSS. In addition to that, What about systemic issues? Lack of resources, you guys already mentioned. Planning time, you already mentioned. Classroom management is a whole section in the book by Nancy and Jan. So one resource I do want to share with you to help solve part of the problem is a defining guide. If you haven't already seen it, it's a free download from the Reading League that will help with the lack of teacher knowledge. If you have good teacher knowledge, it also might help with systemic issues if you could share this information with others in your system. So maybe you're good with it, but somebody else might use it. So do know that that is a free download. Science of Reading is from the Reading League. And if you're at any conferences, they give away the hard copies. So I usually grab a couple and go back and take them back to my school district and hand them out as prizes. They love it. So now we're going to enter technology, right? We have this idea of differentiation. We know that we need to know about the content, deep knowledge of the content. We know that we need deep knowledge about the learner. How does technology help? The use of technology can enhance rather than replace explicit instruction. The barrier is when we expect technology to replace instruction. That's not going to help us. That is a barrier, okay? So we want to make sure we're using technology well. Technology makes it possible to enhance each stage of instruction and practice. So even with technology, more difficult with adaptive, obviously, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but you can do the I do, we do, you do situation before the student assumes full responsibility with their own device. So this is a plug for not doing away with this instructional routine that we all know works, but to do it with using technology before you set them free on their devices to do it on their own. Digital tools to support readers and writers. So apps are available to enhance and extend teachers' capacity to support instructional needs like sortagories. Some apps are educative for teachers and students. So the teachers who have that problem, that sounds bad, have the learning curve of learning the science while they're teaching, which I guess is a problem. Different technology resources can be used that can help the teacher learn the science while they're teaching. The setting on most devices contain customizable features that will help some students with reading and writing, and that is from Young and Hasbrook from their book. So seeing how you can adjust some of the different settings on student devices will also help. So we said earlier about assessment, and Dr. Jan Hasbrook talks about assessment and how to use assessment well. I want us to think about technology in terms of adaptive or prescriptive, right? I'm going to play a short clip here from a webinar that we did with Dr. Jamie Peevler, who did her dissertation on practice. And she shared with us that adaptive programs are based on algorithms that make assumptions based on user responses. So when a user responds correctly, even if it's a guess, this program assumes that it is known and moves the user to another task or skill. Usually it's at that grade level. It's not necessarily related to what they got wrong. It could be related to what they got wrong, but it just puts them back. Unfortunately, some of our kids who are in the red or lower parts of the ladder, they get themselves kind of in a loop and they can't get out without teacher intervention. So we really want to think about, with students at risk, whether adaptive or prescriptive might be better. Also, adaptive programs, most of them do not provide feedback. So we want to be really aware of the amount of feedback that our users are getting. So let me see if I can cue this up right in the area that we need without getting the commercial. It didn't time out on me.
So I think one thing, I think it's a little misleading sometimes that we assume adaptive is always what we want. So it's important to know what adaptive is actually doing. So when you take an assessment, and whether it's, you know, like a formal assessment, or maybe it's a placement assessment in a program, something that's adaptive is based on an algorithm. So when a student gets an item correct, the algorithm decides, oh, that therefore means they have this skill, let's give them something harder. And it could either be harder of the same skill, or it could be harder in an unrelated skill. And based on whether students get the item correct or incorrect, that algorithm determines what the next item is going to be. Well, that's not a good formula for something that's diagnostic, and we need diagnostic in order to be prescriptive. Something that's truly diagnostic should give students several opportunities to show how they can perform on that isolated skill. In fact, it's recommended that you have at least 10 opportunities to show that you know a skill before you can accurately measure whether it's known or not. Adaptive assessments aren't set up that way. And so in an adapted program as well that determines what activities a student could be working on, it's that same logic. So in order to be prescriptive, we need to be diagnostic, and giving kids activities and observing them is a way to be diagnostic. And again, that feedback component too is allowing them to also be diagnostic. Oh, I did know that, or I didn't know that. I thought I got that one right. I'm kind of surprised I didn't. So it's diagnostic from that perspective too. So again, we don't, not that all adaptive is bad, and it's just a matter of what's your purpose. And I think it's important for people to know what diagnostic is needed, why it's needed, and what adaptive can and can't do for you.
That's very helpful. Thanks for that. So when we're thinking about
Sorry, hold on a second.
practice and everything we talked about, we added something new to our website. It's called Try It, because we thought that maybe
Now
you
you're
all
learning
might
about
like to
Try It.
give it a try.
There we go. Sorry. Okay, so while I get myself back here, I think what Jamie said was really important in that adaptive isn't necessarily bad. It's like, who are you using the adaptive with? So in my experience, I think the adaptive software programs, if you will, are better for the kids more at the top of the ladder that can go through that adaptive sequence without getting stuck and not perhaps needing a lot of feedback. And it's a way to challenge them, where the students that need more feedback and more repetitions might inadequately get placed somewhere and maybe even get stuck and get frustrated. So I thought that was so helpful when I heard her talk about that. I encourage you to follow Dr. Jamie Peevler and her work on practice, because she's definitely the most knowledgeable person I know in terms of the science of practice, if you will. So check out her work. And let's see if there are any questions before we continue.
There is one. There was a question asking, do you have any research and evidence-based technology programs that you would recommend?
We don't, we aren't necessarily recommending programs at this time, but I will say that some technology programs are starting to get judged or rated through different states, and also ESSA ratings. So I would be watching for products that have been approved by states. We've recently been approved by Virginia, for example, and that have an ESSA rating. That means that the research is important to that particular company and that particular product. And I would definitely lean toward those products. And then finally, I guess I would ask you to make sure that you know what the purpose of that product is. Sometimes with technology, we might get the technology and use it for a purpose that it's not intended. So I would just be careful with that too. I don't have specific products to recommend, but maybe those guidelines in terms of choosing a product.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? No, okay. Well, Cheryl has been talking about this distinction that's critical between differentiation and scaffolding. And for that part of this that has to do with scaffolding, it becomes very important for teachers to be aware of what it is that they need to be teaching to be sure that that is what they're actually accomplishing. So one of the places that we like to focus on in our work, Cheryl's and mine, is on this word knowledge network, which is based on a multi-component model for teaching literacy, also is foundational to what would be referred to as structured literacy. But the point of this is that the what we're trying to teach and need to be sure we're doing it is that we're teaching the orthographic layer of information about letters, that we're teaching the corresponding sounds that go with that, but together that makes up phonics, but that we're also going on to be sure, to ensure that we're teaching students that the words that they can decode have meanings, often more than one, that they have, that they can be impacted by morphological units, like adding endings, inflectional endings, and that words have a particular function. And by the way, some of these things interact with each other so that these are not discrete categories. And that it is that combination of what kids need to learn that is building the reading circuit. We conceptualize this using this graphic we call the word knowledge network. And the idea of this is that that same word cast is made up of sounds. Cast is represented by letters, C-A-S-T, becomes a type of syllable with a short vowel, cast, that becomes part of bigger words like castaway. It's a word that has meanings, multiple meanings, some of which I might know, some of which I might not as a student, and it's our job to be sure that they're broadening their knowledge about a word and its meanings. Morphology is getting more and more attention. I think we're going to see more of that as we understand the power of morphology on understanding things grammatical, syntactical, and just general vocabulary development. And so cast can be impacted by adding an ing and making it an action that's ongoing, for example. But all of this, I would say where the rubber meets the road for a lot of this information is when we get to syntax, and the word, this single word, isn't really comprehensible until we put it into a context of a phrase or a sentence. And it is this body of knowledge, this layer of knowledge that is our job to know about as teachers, to be able to convey that. To what Cheryl was saying, I can't scaffold this unless I know the content that I'm trying to teach. So I can't break this down and make it more strategic unless I have that knowledge. So with that having been said, what is underneath all of this, sort of the super scaffold, if you will, is the scope and sequence of phonology, at least as we're talking about beginning readers, because we have to give the students some baseline of mastery against which all these other knowledge layers can be built. And if every time they're presented with a word, it's potentially using a sound spelling correspondence with which they're not familiar, then we're starting out in a no-win situation. So think about the value of a scope and sequence of phonics as being kind of the super scaffolder, and why that becomes so important. And from that, we can build the words, and those words can become phrases, and that brings us around all these layers. We also see that core of what we're trying to teach, the layers that we're trying to teach, as also having some other related information that has to go along with it. One layer of that is, how do we assess all of these layers? Do we have assessment information? Should we find assessment information if we don't have it? Because it's that information that's going to move us to that other aspect that Cheryl was talking about, which is differentiation. Because we should be making distinctions, should's a powerful word. We ideally would be making decisions about what we're teaching based on student performance information. But I do want to broaden our idea of assessment beyond a standard measure of some kind. One type of data, if we're fortunate, and we have a lot of this type of information for phonemic awareness and phonics and word reading fluency, there are some areas of literacy learning where we have an abundance of what I would call data that we can work with. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking for evidence of what students know in these other areas where we don't have as many tools. And, again, I'm optimistic that we're getting better at we, the publishers, we, the developers, we, the researchers, are coming up with more ways to assess more areas, but those are not as much at our fingertips. So this is, again, where knowing to even pay attention to some of these other pieces on the part of the teacher is really essential. So you think about, are the kids able to move into the semantic, morphological, or syntactic areas? So assessment's critical. Not all assessment is formal. We love the term that Nancy Hennessy uses, which is dynamic assessment, which is when a student is doing something, we're looking at if they're getting it right or wrong, and we're using that in the moment. Yes, it's right. No, it's not, to influence whether we need to keep teaching or providing more practice. And then there's the instructional part that flows out of assessment information. This is, again, we haven't spoken about the fact that perhaps not everyone should be doing the same thing, and the misconception on the part of some that tier 1 instruction, everybody is doing the same thing for the same amount of time at the same time. And that kind of goes counter to the latter, which says perhaps not everybody is needing the same amount at the same time for the same duration of the same thing. So instruction can differentiate based on that assessment information for each of these layers. And then in terms of practice, this is a place where we have, I think, the potential to make some of our greatest differentiation in terms of how much practice and on what things we provide that practice for different student needs. And whether that's individual students or groups. And of course, we're not going to do this all day for every subject, for everything, but there are some very essential, particularly foundational type of skills where getting that foundation right and accurate is really what we're striving for. So no one can manage and juggle this sort of thing all day long for every subject, but there are some places where it is more essential. So this pattern, though, this relationship between what we're trying to teach, knowing what students know and need to learn, doing instruction, moving from the I do, we do, you do, to the practice on their own. This is an iterative process, which is why that arrow is going in both directions. So we're going to illustrate for the next few minutes examples of the relationship between these areas on this word knowledge network wheel with the kind of data that you might look for or try to access. And we're not saying that there's one right assessment tool, but that there need to be tools whenever possible to help us with this task for differentiation. So for example, when we're dealing with these first couple of areas on the word knowledge network, the phonology and sound to spelling, there are tasks where we ask students to segment the sounds in a spoken word like nap, and we go app. Can they do that? Can they show that they know how many sounds that they're hearing in that word? Then, of course, the next step is, can they associate the correct letter symbol or symbols to represent that sound? And that's where we are at the phonics, phonology sound symbol level. Other tasks that are maybe less explicit, but also very informative, is looking for tasks where word chaining is involved, because now we're moving to a level of flexibility and use of that skill of segmenting and using the sounds to build to move from one word to the next. So can I go from ram to rim to him based on the directions of what sound or position to change? So, wait, let's see. Yes, I think this is just a repeat slide. So we can do that work certainly out of context with single words. Generally, our goal is to have students reading in some kind of connected text. But our experience, Cheryl's and mine, and I'm sure many of yours that are listening here, is that there's some space in between, that there might be particular kinds of practice that you need to be working on to do a better job getting from single word reading to the connected text. And if comprehension is our goal, then there probably are many things more to do to be sure students are paying attention to not only that they're saying the word accurately, but they're also engaging in, is this word telling me who did it? Or is this group of words telling me where? In other words, the words move from just accurate decoding to reading with some level of comprehension. And we have outlined, as part of our work on designing and developing sortagories, which is a technology tool, we have outlined this sequence of activities to try to fill in some of those practice gaps along the way, or practice steps more than gaps along the way. So, for example, we might discover, using that data that I showed you, that the students are not particularly capable of segmenting the sounds accurately. So we might want to work on an activity called Map It in sortagories, and I'll play this, I hope.
Sortagories.
Level A. Map it. First, an important question. Dogs or cats?
Meow.
This activity has 3 parts. In part 1, you'll listen to a word. Select the audio icon to hear the word again. Then, using the top row only, start at the left and click one box for each sound you hear in the word. Click on the Submit button to check your answer. You can use this icon to view an example of this activity. Sometimes you'll see this icon. Use it to view additional help information. A heart symbol indicates words with sound spellings you may not know. Click the heart icon for more information. A yellow heart means you'll learn the way the sound is spelled later. A red heart means you will need to memorize the sound's spelling by heart. For example, the word is bat. Select a box for each sound in the word bat. B, a, t. Then click Submit. Sortagories will show you the letters that spell those sounds. Bat, b, a, t. A red box marks the vowel sound. Now it's your turn. The word is sat. Sat. S, a, t. Sat. The word is at.
I want to stop and make a comment about the value of a technology tool in a situation like this particular skill, because if certain children need more practice, they probably, we want to be sure they're practicing correctly. And there's only one teacher and then a whole lot of students. So one of the things that was our intent in the development of this particular activity was that students who are practicing are always ending up knowing what was right, and that they get that corrective feedback, that they're seeing the process, and they're knowing what is the correct answer, because just clicking tiles and not getting that feedback isn't good practice. We don't know. It's kind of like the adaptive technology. It can be moving on and the students are not really benefiting in an instructive way. So key to this and key to your search for technology tools is for students who are struggling, we want to be sure that they're getting that corrective feedback at the point that they're doing the item so that they're not practicing, perpetuating bad habits and bad practice. I'm sorry if we didn't hear the word.
Oops. Click try again. The word is at.
At.
Not quite. At has two sounds spelled with two letters. A, t, at. The word is be. The word is be. The letter E spells E in be. B, b, E, be.
I think that's the end of our video here. Let me get out of this, I hope. No. Okay, here we go. Now, the same idea about using our diagnostic information, and this is where our knowledge as a teacher about what the text is covering is really important. So some of the kinds of activities that we were illustrating with the technology can be done with the book. For example, if we're working on consonant digraphs, and you can see a lot of them in this little text sample here, then what we can be doing is having the students identify words that follow that. So for example, I might be asking which words have the sound for TH, which could be either or the voiced or the voiceless. And we would ask students to find those words within our text. It's also where we can utilize other resources in our classroom, like sound walls, where we can have students able to refer to a tool like a sound wall to help us get the accurate place of production and distinction of the sounds in the word. Then we can also apply this to syllable types. And so, for example, when I learned the word back, I now have the building block for bigger words. And this is a place where I can see teachers making it a little more challenging for the students that are in that green part of the ladder, where we can say, gee, does anybody know a longer word with back? And we might come up with some of the two-syllable words where one of the syllables is the word back, where the students may still be in that same decodable book, but we're making that task a little bit more challenging. Then the use of semantics. This is an area where I think if we all had a magic wand and could make some tools available tomorrow, we would want some, which is how do we assess vocabulary, students' knowledge of the meaning of individual words. But we can use some existing tools, such as this one, where we can get some insight into whether the student is having trouble at the single word level because they may not understand some of the words in order to answer the questions correctly. Similarly, we can look at tasks that are helping see to what extent students are learning the value and the meaning impact using morpheme units, such as, can I define what painful means using a formula of saying it's using the definition and the word to which it's been attached. So this diagnostic teaching approach will help us determine the level of proficiency. So for example, in this situation, if we look at the text and say, gee, one of the questions we might probe is, do the kids understand the word pause as being a part of an animal? So we could ask the question, which word is part of an animal? And we would ask them to identify that word within the sentence. Or we might ask, we might be working on word relationships like antonyms or synonyms. And so we could ask, which word is an antonym? The point of asking these different layers of language questions with a decodable text is to develop a habit early on, even reading decodable text, which may not be the most, what's the word, content rich, but there are things we can do to make students pay attention to the fact that the words are carrying meaning, and we should spend some time in that interaction. And I also like to mention that a fairly recent book that came out, Strive for Five, is talking about building up these exchanges around up to 5 back and forth with the students or between students. And this type of activity around the decodable text is a really good way to get sort of a double bang for your buck, which is you're really practicing the decodable text while you're also building up that oral language. So I think there's a synergy there between those. And then in terms of morphology, I used this example a minute ago. We can also show students that a word is part of compound words, and what is a compound word, and does that word back mean the same thing as the not opposite of front? When it's attached to other words, or are they completely a whole new meaning of the word? A lot of language goes on in sorting out that kind of vocabulary information. Cheryl.
So if we continue to think about assessment, and you talk about an area that's assessment lacking, syntax is difficult to assess if you're not doing it dynamically, as Nancy Hennessy suggests. So if you have a student who is decoding and they're reading the words well, but they don't understand what the words mean, or if you switch the order slightly, it throws your student off, then you know that they're having trouble at the level of syntax. So you can use your assessment data to determine that, even if your assessment data may not be formal. So for example, this is a passage from the shortened vowel intervention from 95% group, where this paragraph is primarily words, high frequency words, and words with short vowels. First of all, can they decode it, right? Many students can decode it, but then they really don't know what SIS's job is, for example. They don't know the where to find the cubs, because they're not really understanding that where has to have a place, and what did SIS do, that we need to have an action there. So we're breaking down, we could be breaking down here at the level of syntax, and even an intervention based on short vowels. You could use that intervention and that feedback to figure out, oh yeah, they've got the short vowels, but they don't have the comprehension piece to that. So sometimes our syntax information can come from sources that you may not readily expect. So in this case, we're going to ask kids to, in Sortagore's phrase building, we're going to ask them to build a phrase. So in here, they're going to build the bat, and then answer the question about that. Oh, hold on a second. Hold on before we do this. Okay. So this is Brooklyn. I think we can hold. Okay. This is Brooklyn. So before we play this video clip, I want you to think about, we were just coming off of syntax, right? And is the student having trouble at the level of comprehension or decoding? I also want you to think about the Nancy's ladder of reading and writing. I want you to think about the scaffolding and the differentiation. What content does this teacher need to know to teach Brooklyn? And What does the teacher need to know about Brooklyn to teach Brooklyn? So we've got two different things going on here with the teaching of syntax. I'll give that part away, right? This is a decoder. She can decode this, but she's not understanding what it means. So you're going to watch a teacher break it down for her. This is a student who would be in that red-orange area. She may probably have an IEP in the area of language development. So let's give this a read and be thinking about everything you learned today during this video clip.
Build the cat.
Okay, so you're going to build phrases. And I want you to know that phrases are a group of words and we use them to build sentences. So these phrases are going to be parts of sentences, okay? So we're going to click this and listen again for what it told you to build, okay?
Build the cat.
So it said build the cat. So you're going to find the words with your mouse and you're going to drag them to build the cat. Great job. You built the phrase, the cat. Can you read that?
The cat.
Good. Now click submit.
What question does this phrase answer?
So now we're going to click the help information. It's the question mark at the top of your screen, and we're going to see how this part works. So go ahead and click play.
What did it? Tells us the name of the thing or object. The cab stopped. What stopped? The cab. What did it do? Tells us the action that the thing or object did. The dog ran. What did it do? It ran.
And so our phrase is the cat. So we put words together to make meaning. So a group of words can answer a certain question. So we're going to figure out what phrase this question answers. So the first option is what did it? And when we're thinking about that question, it's going to tell us a name of a thing or an object. So does this phrase, the cat, tell us a name of a thing? Yes, the cat is the thing. So go ahead and click what did it? And then click submit.
So in this case, you can see that they're using categories, phrase building, but the teacher is definitely instructing through it using the help. So she's really on a I do. She's pretty much doing a joint lesson there where she's teaching through it. To continue that, you would do a we do, giving Brooklyn more and more responsibility, and then eventually having Brooklyn do that herself on a you do situation, but teaching it first. So what did the teacher need to know about the content? Think about that for a minute. To scaffold correctly, what did she need to know about the content? She needed to be able to define the phrase. She needed to be able to teach how to answer the question, what did it? And thankfully, on categories, it's provided. And you can use this language with in other parts of your teaching as well. What did she need to know about Brooklyn? She needed to know that Brooklyn needs more wait time, right? So you saw the teacher waiting her out a bit. She doesn't respond quickly. Brooklyn was having trouble with syntax, so she had to very directly teach. What does it mean? What did it? What did it do? Where did they do it? When did they do it? All of those syntactic questions. So that all needed to happen to improve Brooklyn's reading comprehension, specifically in the area of syntax. So if you think about decodable text again, and I'm going to take you into my older students again, my 9th graders. I taught ninth grade students how to read. They were pretty much non-readers when they entered, did not know their short vowels. They would read this sentence, and I would have them read it in phrases if they could. Dogs with web claws can swim, hunt, and run on the lawn. So what can dogs do? Well, first of all, my students would have to answer who or what did it. So we would need to know that we're talking about the dogs. What can they do? My students would want to say with web paws, because they would just choose what comes next, because they were not used to syntactically embedded sentences. Like they would just take what comes next. Well, what are they doing? Where's the action word? Oh, can swim. Oh, so more than one thing. They can do more than one thing. Swim, hunt, and run. So those are the kinds of things that I would have to very directly teach in the area of syntax with very simple, decodable short vowel words.
And I think to that point, Cheryl, you're saying something really important is that sometimes the concepts we need to teach, we need to go down in terms of the difficulty of the decoding in order to get the concept. Trying to teach syntax with complex sentences, with complex vocabulary first is perhaps overload. So I think that what you just said is hugely important for differentiation.
Right, and then we would get into what kind of dogs. So we'd have to start all over again on this sentence. We'd go with dogs with web paws can swim. Well, what kind of dogs? Well, some of my students might say swimming dogs, hunting dogs, running dogs. Well, what kind of dogs are they? What phrase tells us what kind of dogs with web paws? Okay, now we can talk about the swimming, because why do they need web paws, right? So this is a seemingly easy sentence because the words are easy, but it's complex, and that's what we have to teach for, complex sentences. Then when we get to where, well, where are the dogs? Well, some of my students would say, well, they're in the water because they're swimming. Well, no, they're actually not in the water. Let's keep reading, and we have to read it again. So what are we getting out of all of this reading it again, right? We're getting all that rereading, we're getting all the fluency, the accuracy, the prosody, and the rereading to get to the question of where. You don't want to ask these questions in order. Like you want to mix them up a little bit. You can ask where before you ask what kind of dogs, for example, because that kids will look for patterns and they just think they know the answer without thinking it through. So this is a really great example, as well as the video before, about what we need to do to teach syntax using pretty easy text, decodably easy text, that is. So what are the benefits of differentiation? What are you, and feel free to put anything in the chat box that you see that might not be listed in the slides. Some of these were taken right from the ladder of reading and writing, but differentiation does allow for us to build relationships with kids because the kids trust us if we give them something they can do. So you want to get them to the point where they can do it. It helps us to observe and assess student capabilities and instructional needs. Explicit instruction and feedback is so important. This feedback, I can't stress that enough. The repeated exposures, how many repeated exposures, Jamie said they need, like, whoops, I just threw my pencil, got excited about exposures. Like we need lots of opportunities and exposures for kids to respond. We need to adjust the pacing. You saw the teacher adjust the pacing. The responsibility was going from the teacher to the student, more the teacher in that case, because it was so directed. Frequent informal assessments to support progress monitoring, and all of this building background knowledge to enhance comprehension based on students' needs, interests, and experiences. And that's all a really good summary in the latter book on page 90.
Yeah, and I would add one more that as I was thinking about what you were just saying, Cheryl, that another huge benefit of differentiation in Tier 1 is to reduce referrals to special ed to intervention, because if we can differentiate within Tier 1 effectively, then we're using our resources and not having to move students to a more restrictive or a more intensive environment. Not that that's bad, but if we can be successful without doing that, if the students can be successful, that would be another goal.
Right, I got a message too here. It builds confidence and joy. That is so true. Many of our students who are struggling are not finding reading particularly fun, right? They will find it more fun when they're confident, and they will find more joy in their learning when they get things right. So yes, that is all so true. So there's lots of benefits in differentiation. We just have to work together and work smarter so that we make it doable. We're here to answer more questions as they come in, but while we're doing that, I want to put this QR code on the screen for you along with our email addresses should you have questions. But this is for the Decodable Duo books from 95% Group. And it's a great way to differentiate using duo books like this where you have all text on one side, no pictures. Can they read that text without the support of pictures? And then you flip it over and you read the text with the pictures. And then you can add that fun and joy with the engaging illustrations. So grab that QR code. You can get a sample of the decodable duos. And some of you mentioned a lack of tools, right? When you're trying to differentiate, that can help to build your toolbox as well.